It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com, or you just email me directly at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Now, I've got a great guest today, Rob McKenzie. You can find him at robmckenzie.org. You can find him on Twitter at rbenmac, RBENMAC. And he's written a book called El Golpe, U.S. Labor, the CIA, and the Coup at Ford in Mexico. He's a former labor leader, and he's investigated this several assassinations that took place in Mexico to destroy the labor movement down there in Mexico at Ford plant. And a very exciting book just came out, so we're lucky to get him. Mr. Rob McKenzie, are you there?
Yes, I am, Ed. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you so much. Hey, before we get into your book here, El Golpe, U.S. Labor, the CIA, and the Coup at Ford in Mexico, tell us about yourself. Who is Rob McKenzie?
I was anti-war in college and I guess became somewhat of a student radical. And when I graduated, I decided to go out into factories and get involved in labor and union organizing and labor politics. And that led me to the Ford Twin Cities assembly plant in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I worked for 28 years. I was an assembler, an industrial electrician, and a full-time union official there. I was the president of the local in 2006 when Ford announced they were going to close the plant. So I started looking for some other jobs and got hired by the UAW International and worked as a regional servicing rep for 10 years. And when I retired in 2016, I decided to do some research on something I'd been involved in and heard things about over the years. And this was an attack that took place on workers at a Ford plant in Mexico City. And that led to the book, which just came out this spring.
Well, give us an idea. What this was like 1990 this took place?
Yeah, the main event took place in January 1990, but it was preceded by several years of turmoil and struggle inside that Ford plant and in the country of Mexico at the time. Yeah,
there was a big teachers' war went on down there too as well with the education department and the government down there. But what happened? What was going on at this plant in there?
Well, Mexico was really in turmoil in the 80s. I mean, their economy had collapsed due to dependence on oil, and the Institutional Revolutionary Party, who'd ruled Mexico for 65 years, started moving to hyper-competitive, free market, neoliberal type capitalism, and there was a lot of opposition to that, and it culminated in a big election in 1988 where a left-of-center candidate who had socialists in his coalition almost won. They probably did win. The military seized the ballot boxes, and the government declared victory. Now, some of the same type of forces who'd been involved in that were involved in organizing in the Ford plant. And in 1987, they ended up on strike through a fairly complicated series of events. Ford fired everybody, which was legal under Mexican labor law. And when they rehired most of them, 600 of them they fired, but when they rehired most of them, it resulted in a 40% wage and benefit cut. And the government union, the Mexican Confederation of Workers, the CTM, I'll call it from here on out, supported this. And an opposition group aligned with the left and a political party in the left, the Revolutionary Workers' Party, really came into complete control of the local and started instituting a lot of reforms. I mean, they were doing things that we in unions in America take for granted, like having regular meetings and having grievances filed and being able to bring complaints to their leadership. This was pretty new stuff in Mexico, and they really were gaining a following. Now, at this point, they start to get entangled with the CIA. This becomes a threat to the PRI government, to the CTM, and the involvement of this left party really set off alarms in the CIA. And working with Ford, they fired 4 of the 6 local executive committee members who were very close to winning a significant national position in the CTM. And that resulted in, of course, another series of fights and hunger strikes and protest marches. And in December, Ford had given a big profit sharing in the spring, but not taken taxes out to help the incumbents in that election. And in December, they took taxes out, and people were left with basically no checks, and that resulted in another wildcat strike. The workers walked out of the plant, and they returned after Christmas. And the Friday before Christmas, some of the leaders had come to the plant to put out a leaflet about a meeting with the national leader of the CTM. They were kidnapped. And the workers in the plant went on a sit-down strike. They went on strike, refused to work, and stayed in the plant until their leaders were released, and they were on that Friday, January 5th. The following Monday, when they came into work, there were around 300 thugs. They're called golpeadores in Spanish. And they were in the plant, and they began intimidating and threatening the workers. The workers were prepared for that. They'd had some indication something like this might happen, and they confronted them, drove them out the plant. But these thugs opened fire and shot 10 people. One of them was wounded and later died. One of the wounded later died. And following that, the workers occupied the plant. And they raised demands about their pay, about the fired leaders, and demanded a national congress on labor rights in Mexico. So they held the plant for 2 weeks before they were driven out. And then they continued the strike for months. It took months. They were not really up and running. This happened in January. They were really not up and running until August. But again, they fired 600 people and restored order. So it took the total combined forces of the PRI, the CTM, Ford, and I was researching the CIA's involvement in that. And that's what a lot of the book is about.
Well, let me ask you this. You mentioned that some of these union leaders were kidnapped. Do we know who was behind the kidnapping?
No. Again, it's a mysterious group. They don't know who it was. After the sit-down strike, they dropped them off at the local police station. So some of them were thinking they'd been arrested, but they never had been arrested. And again, this was the group, which I believe was led by a gangster named Wallace de la Mancha, who was a contract agent for the CIA. So that's who I believe kidnapped him, and that really set off the whole drama that continued for the next few months.
You know, this is fascinating. You know, I did a bunch of shows about those mass graves, those students down there in Mexico about 3 or 4 years ago, I guess it was.
Yeah,
yeah, right. And you know, with people locally, local to the area. Now, it's always like a shadowy group that no one knows who they are. Even the cartels, like people don't know who they are and who's behind this and who's doing this. Do you have any information about that?
Well, about the students?
Not just the students, because in the instance with the students, like no one really, there was like a ghost. No one knew who was really behind it. And now when you're talking about these kidnappings, like no one really knows. Like, how could that be?
Well, and so the papers widely reported that this gangster named Wallace de la Mancha had been leading the attackers. Now, through a series of Freedom of Information Act requests with the State Department, I got 11 embassy cables, and they started on January 10th of 1990 and went through August. Nowhere does the embassy cables mention who was responsible. When Ford came in and met with the embassy on January 10th, Ford claimed that this attacking group of 300 people had been members of the Revolutionary Workers' Party, which was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, if they'd bothered to read the papers, they would have known that that was totally untrue. And they, of course, changed their story pretty quickly. But I think that shows the Ford management did not know who these 300 people were that came into the plant and opened fire into the 5 different plants. Now, Uriarte, who was the general secretary of the CTM, and he represented 3 Ford plants in Mexico, the Mexico City plant, the Cuautitlán plant where this happened, and one in Hermosillo and one in Chihuahua. He had been in Washington. I got a document out of the archives of Wayne State University. He had been in Washington, D.C. in November of '88, and this was a memo a flight document. The memo had been written by the assistant director of the International Affairs Department, the AFL-CIO, and he had previously been the AFL, the American Institute for Free Labor Development, director in Mexico. And on the flight were Tom Donahue, who was the secretary-treasurer of the AFL-CIO, Owen Bieber, who was the president of the UAW, two staff people that worked for them. One was a guy named Mark Anderson, and the other was a guy named Steve Beckman. And the fifth guy was a guy named William Doherty, who I spent pretty much a whole chapter researching. He was the director of the American Institute for Free Labor Development for 30 years, and beyond question in my mind was a career CIA agent. And on this flight are three Mexican labor leaders. One is Hector Urarte, the general secretary of the Ford CTM, and the guy the workers at the time blamed for the assault. So again, and so Wallace de la Mancha is really a shadowy figure. Now, I did some research, and I got an interview with a former executive director who left the CIA in the 60s or early 70s, and he said career CIA agents never are directly responsible for dirty ops. They always look for paramilitary, mercenaries, or gangsters. And La Mancha was a gangster, and he had been involved in some kind of thuggish things like beating people up, teachers in a lobby or something. But he was leading a small army that had walkie-talkies, submachine guns, very well organized and prepared, of 300 people. So this was far beyond anything he'd done. And this went bad. When the workers fought back, occupied the plant, they got a great deal of sympathy and support from the public. Investigations were launched. A lot of questions were being asked about La Mancha. He died mysteriously a few months later. Rumors that he was assassinated. And what this secretary to the executive director said in his interview, he said one of the reasons they get gangsters, mercenaries, paramilitaries, if things go bad, if they go sour, if they can expose the CIA, they're terminated. And I believe that's what happened to La Mancha. Now, I found there's not a whole lot of information about him. I found some Spanish language articles. No one even knows exactly what his nationality was. But, so this is speculation, but I think you can, by research, can rule out Ford as being the one that paid for these attackers. The CTM, the union itself, went to Congress and denied their involvement and referenced vague, mysterious forces out there that do this kind of thing. So, by a process of elimination, it's most likely the CIA. That's all I can say, but that makes the most sense by far.
And the CIA's motive was to prop up the government in Mexico.
And really what they were worried about was leftist penetration and organization in the unions. That's what they were worried about here. The PRT was making great strides in organizing in labor. And they had almost lost this election in 88 to a left-of-center government whose coalition included communists and socialists. In fact, they probably did less. Only 45% of the ballots were ever counted. And they would not allow a recount of even that 45%. So here you have a Mexico. There's a long history of the Reagan administration of what they were thinking and doing about Mexico, which I go into in the book. But at that point, the CIA looked like they had lost control of the situation. And they moved a new diplomatic and intelligence team into Mexico as soon as that election was over. John D. Negroponte, I don't know if your listeners know who he is. He was the first director of national intelligence. He was the ambassador to Iraq after the invasion. In the early 80s, he'd been the ambassador to Honduras when the Reagan administration was funding the Contras in violation of a law that Congress had passed, saying we're not going to fund these Contras. So that was one of the things that led to the Iran-Contra scandal, is the way to fund the Contras. What Negroponte was doing was having the Honduran government take over support for the Contras, and then in turn getting huge swaths of aid to Honduras, hundreds of millions of dollars of aid. So he had played a role in supporting the Contras in Nicaragua. As soon as that election over, he became the ambassador in Mexico. The deputy chief of mission, the number 2 guy in the embassy, was a guy named Robert Pastorino, who had also been in Honduras with Negroponte for a while, and then went to the National Security Commission, National Security Council with Reagan as an expert on Latin America. He was also sent to Mexico. As a point of interest, he wrote the first conceptual draft of NAFTA while he was in Mexico. And they also took the chief of station for the CIA in Honduras with them to Mexico when they went. So it's very clear they were preparing for a fight there in Mexico with the left.
Yeah, just to be clear, National Security Council is very, very important to make that distinction, because that was the Ollie North bunch that was involved with Iran-Contra, doing it, coke smuggling and arms smuggling, about as crazy again. And Negroponte, it's fascinating you mentioned the name Negroponte. Haven't heard that name in so long. What is he doing today? Do we know?
He's still alive,
yeah.
But I haven't seen much about him recently. He did a long interview in 2000. This is before he became the ambassador to Iraq and the first director of national intelligence, where he was pretty much open about a lot of these things that had happened in Honduras. So I think what that really showed me was the close ties between the national security community and NAFTA. I mean, they both, Negroponte listed as his chief achievement in Mexico as facilitating negotiations for NAFTA between Salinas and Bush. So this was all tied up, too, with the economic changes going on in Mexico and securing it as a low-wage haven for U.S. employers.
Gotcha, but now you're saying that Ford was not complicit in this these assassinations and this coup to put down this union.
No, I would not say not complicit. I would say they did not hire the thugs to come into their plant and shoot up their plant. That is just not the way they operate. Way too much bad publicity. Right. In the book, I document a lot of fairly sinister things they were involved with, along with the other U.S. auto companies. I tell one guy who was interviewed, one of the Mexican dissidents, he was pulled off the assembly plant by their security force, which is, a contract to Ford, but they're really quite a militarized security force. They took him off the line, took him to the edge of the plant, and had him start digging a grave. Wow. Saying, you know who this is for? And then questioned him about his union activities, his political beliefs. And they kept him there a whole day. He finally got away. The next day, they brought him again, and one of his fellow workers started a wildcat strike to get him off there. So that's sinister stuff. I mean, a 40% wage cut in '87. I mean, that's hard for us American workers to understand. They're so low paid. I mean, they're making like $2.35 an hour or something now. And, in 1987, they gave them a 40% wage cut. And the other thing I found in my research is a U.S. senator here who we had meetings with and brought some of these dissidents to, named Paul Wellstone,
sure.
United States Senator Paul Wellstone,
sure.
wrote letters to Mexico asking about what happened here. So he was turned over to an assistant secretary of state named Janet Mullins, who reassured him that nothing untold had happened. This had just been an internal Union Mexico thing, and there's really no problems here. And basically left out all kinds of information that was available in the embassy cables, and she probably had more. As soon as she got out of her position with the Bush administration, she became a vice president of Ford Motor Company. So again, that is not complicit to me. That's at least involved in the cover-up of what happened there.
And did you say before, to clarify for me, $2.35 an hour, you're saying $2.35 an hour?
Yeah, that's about what they're making now. And one of the really bad results of this failure to establish an independent union movement in Mexico, wages have been frozen or declined in Mexico for the last 30 years. Today, Mexican wages are lower than Chinese manufacturing wages, and it did not start off that way. So, there's the independent union movement is arising again in Mexico, and, at this point, actually, the U.S. government is supporting that. I think they've come to the conclusion, at least the Biden administration, that this super low-wage, exploited populace in the border is politically destabilizing in the U.S., which not only all the jobs that were lost to that, but also the immigration. I mean, people, when they're faced with that kind of economic hardship, they immigrate. So hopefully things are going to turn around, but this about 30 years of that really exploited labor pool in Mexico.
But it just goes to show that all those who cry these crocodile tears about the immigration and migrants and asylum seekers pouring over the border, you hear it ad nauseum by some of these people. If they were really concerned about that flow of humanity, all we got to do here is put an end to this kind of oppression and this kind of wage gouging of the workers down there, and they would happily stay where they are. But they're not stupid. They know this. They're not stupid, right? Yeah. What about you mentioned sinister before? Okay, what other sinister deaths can you attribute to this policy?
Well, in my research, when I started off this, I don't have an academic background. I never published anything. I've been the editor of a local union newspaper was my total qualifications. I thought, well, we'll do a 4 or 5 page paper about what happened in Cuautitlán. I think I can find documents that link the American Institute for Free Labor Development to those events. So I thought, well, there's certainly some crack academic who's written a book about AFELD and its relationship to the CIA, and if I can prove AFELD involvement, I will prove CIA involvement. I also thought, and I knew people in the National AFL-CIO, that the AFL-CIO at some point had come to terms with this past, acknowledged it, counted for it, and moved on. Both of those things were totally wrong. From what I've seen, U.S. labor historians avoid the issue of CIA and labor like the plague. Not only is it taboo and off limits, I think they ostracize labor historians who do dabble in it. So when I started trying to research AFELD, I was really starting pretty much from scratch. There was one professor who's written about this quite a bit in the last 20 years, but I started with a blank slate about what was the American Institute for Free Labor Development. Now, one of the things I focused on is coming from the labor movement was why did labor put up with this? And they didn't always. There was always a debate in the labor movement about CIA involvement in labor. And there was a fierce debate in the 1960s about AFELD, AFL-CIO foreign policy in the CIA after Victor Reuther from the UAW gave an interview to the Los Angeles Times in 1966 and linked those things. And all hell broke loose. The council, AFL-CIO Council, passed a resolution denouncing him, and his brother Walter, who was president of the UAW, led the UAW out of the AFL-CIO over this issue and started a rival labor federation to the AFL-CIO. So, this debate had gone on for several years, and I was trying to say, well, how did this debate end? These guys are really bringing it. It ended with Walter's death in 1970. And I thought I knew a lot about UAW history when I started this. I did not know there was a mystery to Walter Reuther's death when I started this research. But, I had really established, I said, boy, there's really a motive here for the CIA to kill this guy. And I remember the first time I looked in Wikipedia and it said the mysterious death of Walter Reuther. And I did a lot of research on that, and there is a lot of evidence. The National Transportation Safety Board did an excellent investigation of this. In my mind now, after working in this for a long time, there is no question that Reuther was assassinated. And what people who want to deny that, I think they're being speculative. What is the evidence that they have that this was an accident? So I can go over the details of that, and I've actually even made more progress on this since the book was published. So I don't know how much time you want to spend on that. We
got a whole half a show left, but it's just about to take the first break, so this is perfect timing. Now you're talking about the death of Rutherford was a suspicious plane crash, right?
Yes. The National Transportation Board, in their summary, said the plane, it was night.
Let's get into more detail when we come back. But also, too, you mentioned Paul Wellstone before, too, who also died in some might say is a suspicious plane crash. Now, what about Rob McKenzie, man? When's the last time you flew? You know what I'm saying, man?
I'm a poor man. I don't take private jets.
Okay, very good. Okay, Rob McKenzie, staying close to home after doing all this work here. You can find Rob McKenzie at his website, robmckenzie.org. That's McKenzie, robmckenzie.org. You could find him on Twitter at rbenmac, RBENMAC, and the book is called Golpe, U.S. Labor, the CIA, and the Coup at Ford. Now, right before the break, you were telling us about the very suspicious death of this fellow named Ruther.
Yes. Walter Reuther, who was the president of the United Auto Workers and really had a long career in organizing that. And his brother, Victor, was also involved in these events, who was the International Affairs Director of the UAW. So they had really challenged CIA about their involvement in labor, where George Meany was defending it and covering it up. That led to a split in 1967. The UAW stopped paying dues and left the AFL-CIO over this issue of international affairs and the CIA, after a motion was passed condemning Victor. Now, and they continued, their animosity, and they set up a rival labor federation, Reuther did, with the Teamsters and chemical workers, I believe. And I was trying to figure out, well, what happened to this debate? It ended on May 9th, 1970, with an airplane crash of a private jet at an airfield in northern Michigan in Pellston, near the new UAW Education Center. So Reuther and his companions, the pilots on this private jet, were all killed. So the NTSB investigated this, and they issued a 14-page report. They said the plane crashed for two reasons. One is first of all, they said there's normally lights in a runway at night called variable approach path indicators. And when a pilot is approaching, he can make sure their plane is at the right angle, and they can tell what their altitude is. Those lights were shut off just before they landed. Apparently, a light on the runway broke, so the airfield switched them to another runway where the runway was lit, but they didn't have the approach path lights. So that meant that the pilot had to rely on his altimeter or altitude meter. Now, the NTSB found that the altimeter was reading between 200 and 250 feet higher than the plane actually was, because of 7 defects in the altimeter. Vital calibration arm was loose because the screw wasn't seated. The screw had come loose. There were 6 other defects in this altimeter, having to do with wrong parts, missing parts, misassembled parts. And so they pointed at that. Now, the manufacturer of the altimeter was a company called Colisman Instrument. They wrote a report saying, we manufactured that altimeter for the military. It was not even authorized for private aviation. No idea how that altimeter got in this plane. So, I mean, you'd have to, I'm sure the NTSB was suspicious. They never say in their report, this was an accident, this was sabotage. But what did happen was the FBI got involved. And so now I know the whole story of that. A Detroit TV reporter named Bill Gallagher filed a Freedom of Information Act request in the mid-1980s, asking the FBI for everything they had on Reuther. After 2 years of him hounding them constantly, they finally sent him paperwork saying, well, we have 8,400 pages on Reuther, but they only would release a tiny fraction of that and withheld most of it with exemptions to the FOIA Act. They had 200 pages on the crash that they refused to release on grounds of national security. Now, they released about 13 pages. So Bill Gallagher is still alive and active, and when I finally got a hold of him this year, he said nobody has ever contacted him about this. He donated all his paperwork on this to the Reuther Library at Wayne State University, so it's available to researchers what there is there. So I've got the documents they released, and highly suspicious. I filed a new FOIA request for those 200 pages. I didn't see how they can maintain a national security exemption. So So I've been through 2 rounds. The FBI says they can't find anything to do with Walter Reuther, but that's in the appeal now with the Office of Information Policy at the Justice Department. So I'm still holding hope that we're going to be able to get those, which I think would point to a CIA assassin. But in any case, there were 200 pages, never released. The NTSB said bad altimeter. Now, what's even more suspicious, in 1968, in October, Walter and Victor were on the same type of private jet, same conditions, raining at night, landing at Dulles Airport. And when the pilot came down through the clouds, he realized he was much too low, hit a girder. They almost died in that accident. And they pointed to an altimeter on that one, too. So that was October of 68. A few months before the fatal crash in May of 70, that same private jet had to go in for maintenance because the altimeter was out of tolerance. Now, all those things could have been investigated, and I think that would have been the FBI's job. How did that altimeter get in that plane? I mean, there's records.
Let me ask you a question. A couple of questions real quick. This plane, was this a plane they owned? Was it a chartered plane? Was it a rented plane? What was this?
It was a leased Learjet. They leased it. Now, that night on May 1970, I thought the biggest question about this whole thing was, did anyone have time to put in an altimeter? It was only on the ground for 20 minutes at the Detroit airport. So, I think that's the biggest question mark in this. Was there enough time? Now, when I got a hold of Bill Gallagher, he had interviewed Victor Reuther a couple times, and he told me that Victor believed that the guy who'd been on the plane beforehand, which was the singer Glenn Campbell, had also been involved in this, as Glenn Campbell was an extreme right-winger. Now, that's pure speculation, but I thought that was very interesting because it helped address that 20-minute issue there.
And what about
some more?
The airport, Rhinestone Cowboy? Now, was there was there the airport? Was it a private airport? What do we know about the airport?
They dropped Campbell off at the Detroit City Airport, Detroit Metro, and then went to the Wayne County Airport, which was just a few miles away, to pick up the Reuthers. That's the way I understood it. And they were there 20 minutes.
Yeah, these small airports, man, they're cesspools of intelligence and smugglers and planes changing titles and what goes on at these private airports is just beyond belief. Now, did you look into the Wellstone crash too?
Well, I knew Wellstone, and I think all of us at the time, I've got a picture of him and his wife and me on my website from a Fair Trade Coalition celebration one time. He was very supportive of this. I think all of us were suspicious, and what I know about that was that totally came down to pilot error. That's all I ever read. And I think there were a lot of people looking at that one because there had been so many of these type of deaths of progressive and plane crashes.
Yeah. Now, we were joking before, but now what about yourself? You just came out with this book, El Golpe, U.S. Labor, the CIA, and the Coup at Ford in Mexico. Have you experienced any kind of pushback or any kind of suspicious circumstances around your life?
I had some problems with my emails and relationship to the AFL-CIO, the Solidarity Center, the Coup in Bolivia. But that was it. I mean, that's really all the AFL-CIO and all the affiliate unions, all the active staff people have absolutely stopped talking to me. They will not. And these are people I've been friends with for 20 years. Now, the retirees are very helpful and supportive of what I'm doing. But the active people have obviously been told not to have any interactions with me. So, I kind of miss them. But on the other hand, come on, guys, this is on you. You know this isn't right. The people I know this isn't right, too. So I really don't have a problem with that. Now, in Mexico, this is a very dangerous thing.
Yeah.
I mean, this whole subject, organizing unions, very dangerous. And everybody who does something there, his life is in danger. I've never really felt that way. I mean, I know how vindictive and petty some of these people can be, but I've not been afraid for my safety.
But and what was your involvement with the coup in Bolivia?
Well, there was a coup against Morales. Well, so I got a couple emails saying, this gets into the whole issue of the Solidarity Center, which I believe is fairly complicated. And I went into this saying, I'm not going to get into this one. But I came up with some original research about how it got started, so I put that in there. In any case, I got some emails saying, no, the Solidarity Center was involved in this. So I put out an email to my email list, and I included the Solidarity Center. I had their contact info and said, listen, the Solidarity Center has, I believe, been involved in destabilizing the Morales government. And this was really linked to the AFL-CIO's refusal to open all their archives and files that they have on Cold War and the CIA. And I put out a mail, specifically criticizing Richard Trumka for not denouncing this coup. So about an hour after I sent that email out, my email stopped being able to send. I could receive, but I couldn't send. So I've had this Comcast account for 20 years, and I've never had a problem. So I switched to a Gmail account I have just to make sure it worked fine. Nothing wrong with my computer at all. It was just this one email account. So, and during this period when it was down, where I couldn't send anything, Trumpka came out with a statement opposing the coup against Morales, with like an hour after I sent out my email. So I said, wow, that's effective anyway. I started to call Comcast Technical and find out what was wrong with my email. And, I went on to hold for a brief period. And, I said, well, I better double check to get what the error code is. I went on, my email was working, the technician answered the phone, and everything was fine. So that's odd to me. I never had anything happen like it before or since, but it made me wonder.
And I bet after an hour on the phone with Comcast, you wound up increasing your cable package, right? You wound up getting HBO Plus.
Actually, it was pretty fast. It was only like 5 or 10 minutes. I expected to be on there an hour, but it was actually fairly fast. Yeah.
No, you mentioned too that you said that since you came out with the book, you had some new information about these crashes. Did you tell us that, or did you forget? Well,
that was Bill Gallagher. I figured out who did this Freedom of Information Act, about the 200 pages.
Gotcha.
And I got a hold of Gallagher, and he's very supportive and friendly, and he's working with me on this.
So great. Then we can expect more revelations to come from this work here in this investigation in Mexico and these assassinations?
Well, the one U.S. labor historian who works with me on this is a professor at the University of Manchester. And he says, I don't think they're ever going to give you anything. So he's been doing this his whole life, and he's one of the few people. I think the Office of Information Policy is pretty irritated with the FBI. So I did get documents from the State Department, but we'll see if we get them from the FBI. Because when I started working on this, I was looking for a graduate student who knew how to do this kind of thing. Looked, or a professor. I have ended up with a graduate student living in London who's from Cambridge. The professor who's helped me is from Manchester. The publisher is in London, Pluto Press, and this manuscript was rejected by all sorts of U.S. publishers. They were afraid of it, I think. And I was looking for an insurance company in case one of these yahoos wanted to try to give me some kind of harassment suit. The only insurance company that would touch me was Lloyd's of London. So I'm pretty centered in the United Kingdom here. So that was never my intention.
Yeah, that's interesting too, as well. Yeah. That's a good question. What do you make of the labor movement here in the United States, and especially specifically this Amazon? We see this local Amazon guy in New York. Is it Amazon, or am I thinking of Starbucks? This local fellow.
Yeah, no, it's Amazon. They're both. They both got something going on. So while I was working on this, I realized, okay, this is forbidden territory. I am not supposed to be talked. This is why, if I do this, I will be treated like a dissident, which I have much of my life. I know what that meant. But also during this time, the UAW was undergoing a major corruption scandal. 2 of the presidents I'd contacted about getting into the archives or got prison sentences, 3 vice presidents, the region director, 5 staff people, all varying kinds of corruption. And I know, and this was troubling to me, because I knew this was not, it wasn't like nobody had any idea this stuff was going on. dissent was so stifled that this was allowed to grow and ruin one of the finest organizations that workers ever had in the United States. So I decided I'm just going to stick to my guns and be a dissident, whatever it takes. Now, that also, the people who've reached out and helped me, are fairly far to the left of me, but I have to say that I'm really glad for their help, and I can see their point of view, and I've really taken another look at labor. And I knew this it is in terrible shape, refuses to change. The 10,000 people who run U.S. labor unions, for the large part, are in the top 10% of wage earners, and they don't want to change anything. They're happy with what it's at. But what's very encouraging is this Amazon labor union. They've decided this is what we need to win a union election. This is how we're going to structure ourselves. This is how much pay we're going to get. This is the control people are going to have, and really established a new type of union. It was based a lot on the United Electrical Workers, who've done the same thing. It's a smaller left-of-center union, has done the same thing. And I don't know a lot of details about the Starbucks Workers United, but I think it's a similar type of thing. They formed kind of an independent union, which is affiliated with the SEIU. So I think those things are very encouraging, as are the rise of these independent unions in Mexico now at GM-Sao and several other places they're having success. The only drawback is things like what happened at Staten Island or at Silao. It takes people in these workplaces willing to commit and organize. And we just don't have enough of those people. The more people we have willing to do that, the more success labor is going to have.
Yeah, it's a tough road, man, and I really do. I want to thank you for your service, man. Here, you really put a lot of work into this investigation of this El Golpe, U.S. labor, the CIA, and the coup at Ford in Mexico. How have book sales and response to this book been?
I don't see the total sales figures, so I'm not sure. I can see the libraries. There's 166 libraries have purchased it, so I think that's encouraging. And the people who I care about who've read it are really like it. And I've got a lot of very positive feedback, and I have no regrets about this. And I'll still do. I think there's a lot of important things in the book, and I'm going to do everything I can to encourage people to read it.
I agree with you there. And what are you working on next?
Well, this took me 5.5 years.
Yeah.
So I don't, I'm not sure I want to launch another book. I am working with a postdoc who I met in the course of doing this kind of research, and actually wrote a really good paper in 2018 about the American Institute for Free Labor Development. And so I'm hoping, if I get these documents, that we can work together on this, and I can give him the lion's share of the hard work.
Yeah, it would be great too, like a documentary film or even a thriller. You got everything in there. You got labor unions, assassins, South American, CIA. You got it all in there. Remember the old days? We used to have movies like that. What happened?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm in contact with a couple of documentary filmmakers, and I'm trying to slowly encourage them to take this on. There's a lot of photo archives which I was not able to get, but I did locate them. So there's enough photos and a little video, you could make a good documentary about this.
Gotcha. Now, in the story, El Golpe, U.S. labor, the CIA, and the coup at Ford in Mexico, are there any questions I've neglected to ask you that you really want the audience to know about in the next 2 minutes?
2 minutes. I would say Lane Kirkland is another guy who really needs to be looked at. He became president of the AFL-CIO in 1979. He came from the Southern planter aristocracy. His great-grandfather was in the Confederate cavalry, owned 160 enslaved people who were freed by Harriet Tubman. Lane went to Georgetown and took a special program for students interested in international affairs. And the same year the CIA began funding AFL-CIO activities in Europe, he went to the research department of the AFL. So he's another character that really needs a hard look.
Yeah, and I noticed that Philip Agee was mentioned, too, on your website. How is he involved in all this?
Well, in 1976, he left the CIA in 1968 and published a book in 1976 called Inside the Company CIA Diary. The paperback, I got 700 pages. Devastating factual critique of CIA activities and Latin America. Many of the people in the book, he names as CIA agents. William Doherty, the executive director of AFELT. Joe Bierny, who was president of Communication Workers, he calls a top CIA collaborator involved in a lot of these things. Irving Brown, who was an international affairs director of the AFL-CIO, career CIA agent. So I know, I researched him to say, well, did anyone ever contradict him or prove him wrong? No, just the opposite. He was found to be very accurate. So that, if anybody's got the time or energy and you really want to know what daily life was like in the CIA in Latin America, great book.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And he was a staple back on WBAI back in the old days. And I believe that they created that law about outing CIA agents. You're no longer allowed to, it's a crime to out someone as a CIA agent. I believe that was because of Philip Agee. Yeah, but, Rob McKenzie, we're out of time. I really enjoyed this. robmckenzie.org. You can find his work. You can follow Rob McKenzie on Twitter at RBENMAC. RBenMac. And the book, once again, is El Golpe, U.S. Labor, the CIA, and the Coup at Ford in Mexico. Thank you so much, Rob McKenzie.
Thanks for having me. It was nice speaking with you.
And keep up the good work, man. Keep it up. You know, I know it's thankless. You know what I mean? You're out there alone, and it's thankless work, and people are tampering with your emails and all kind of crap going on. And we joke around about not being able to take a plane, but honestly, it's true. You know, and so I want to thank you for your service, man.
Well, thank you. There's a lot of people have helped me, and in the acknowledgments in my book, I try to mention them because I got a lot of help in doing this.
Excellent, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.